At least two separate things are true about the Chinese government and the coronavirus. One is that the Chinese government really did fail in the early parts of the outbreak quite catastrophically. Author and professor at UNC Chapel Hill, Zeynep Tufekci, suggests it may have been like what happened in the Soviet Union with Chernobyl, where the truth does not get up the chain to the leaders because of the fear of passing along bad news and a refusal to believe the worst. Quote, Hubei authorities may have lied not just to the public, but also upward to the central government. The second thing that's true is the Trump administration clearly, in the crassest, most obvious way, wants to turn this crisis into a kind of rhetorical hammer they can wield against China in order to obscure their own Chinese government-like failings by blaming someone else. Now, something you probably have heard from a certain corner of the right is this theory that the coronavirus, quote, escaped from the lab.
It looks like there is evidence that this virus escaped from the lab.
This notion that this escaped from a lab actually, I think, is supported by the vast majority of the science that we see out there.
Circumstantial evidence is now surfacing in the intelligence community that the coronavirus, COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, did escape from the Wuhan lab.
Now, a lot of people on the right love that phrase, escape from the lab, because it sounds like something from a Marvel movie or a comic book. It sounds like they're talking about a man-made virus that China was weaponizing that got out of control, which is what the Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo, seemed to imply over the weekend and then had to immediately walk back.
Do you believe it was man-made or genetically modified?
Look, the best experts so far seem to think it was man-made. I have no reason to disbelieve that at this point.
Your Office of the DNI says the consensus, the scientific consensus, was not man-made or genetically modified.
That's right. I agree with that. Yeah, I've seen their analysis. I've seen the summary that you saw that was released publicly. I have no reason to doubt that that is accurate.
Now, I'm going to chalk that up to some sort of connection failure there, but it did seem like the Secretary of State said, yes, it's man-made, and then a second later saying, yes, that's correct, it's not man-made. And to be clear, when they say escape from the lab, it doesn't mean a man-made bioweapon that got out, okay? Both scientists and the U.S. intelligence community agree that this coronavirus was not man-made. That is not a possibility. It came from a natural source. It didn't come from a lab. People have looked at the genes. The transmission was likely from animal to human. Even Dr. Anthony Fauci, a member of the president's coronavirus task force, said there is no scientific evidence the coronavirus was made in a Chinese lab. Now, we still do not exactly know how it made its way to humans, but that is not part of Trump TV's escape from the lab theory. What they are talking about is Chinese scientists, public health officials, virologists at a virology lab, hard at work to prepare their country and the world for the possibility of a novel coronavirus, studying one, maybe that came from bats or another animal, and then in the process of studying it, somehow tragically contracting the virus unbeknownst to them and then spreading it. Now, I should tell you right now, there's no evidence of this, certainly no concrete evidence. If it were true that this Wuhan virology lab was studying this and then someone got infected and they infected everyone else, it would be heartbreakingly tragic, but also weirdly exculpatory for the Chinese government. And here's why. Because one of the early, more plausible theories to emerge, I think there's more evidence for it, was that the wildlife wet market in Wuhan was where the virus first made its species jump from an animal to a human. And here's the thing. Wildlife wet markets are generally places where all kinds of fairly exotic live animals are stored in very close quarters and then slaughtered on site. And it would not be the first time that this happened. Wet markets such as these have been implicated in previous outbreaks of coronaviruses, including the SARS outbreak. And public health authorities within China and outside of China have been for a long time railing against wildlife wet markets as essentially global biohazards. But the Chinese government has refused to shut them down permanently. And that more likely is the theory that makes the Chinese government look worse. Like the theory that it came out of one of these wet markets is the one that makes the Chinese government look like they really screwed up. Because it means the Chinese government defied public health concerns, urgings of their own public health folks in China, and they kept those markets open and unleashed a global pandemic. And if that's true, I think that's the far more insidious version. While the escape from a lab theory is a story of scientists hard at work trying to save the world from a global pandemic and then tragically managing to release it, it's a kind of benign but tragic story. But here's the thing. None of the facts matter here because they like that phrase escape from the lab so much in China. And so the Trump administration is so desperately grasping at straws, trying to find someone to blame. They don't even seem to understand what they themselves are saying. They just want a convenient scapegoat.